How's it going, everyone? And welcome all in for another edition of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. We got a few different things to kind of go over in this episode. I'll be interviewing Andy Patton from the Locked On Zags podcast and Locked On College Basketball podcast. Always great to have him on, and we'll discuss how he would rate the Zags off-season, what maybe the expectations should be, realistic expectation for the Zags team should be, and maybe which of the newcomers he expects to really step up. And then also we'll talk about some general WCC topics as well. Always great to have him on and chat with him about WCC hoops. But a couple of topics before we get into that I wanted to just kind of like check off the box here. And the first is a Yahoo Sports report that has the NCAA increasing its scholarship limits across all sports, but specifically for basketball, will be going from 13 to 15, which may not sound like a significant thing, but it really is. As different teams, and we've seen teams start to stockpile players to be able to kind of help your development down the road. This could also help with thinking about, as the transfer portal has run wild over the last few years, this could also give an opportunity to really kind of dive more into the development components and really look at more freshmen as not necessarily your instant options, because for roster spots like 10 through 15, maybe you do start to think about, all right, what players we could spend some time developing and use a couple of years down the road, a year or so down the road, not have to and you can use those other roster spots a little bit more heavily on the impact of today. So interesting news that has come out in the last week or so about scholarship limits. This is going to impact, obviously, every WCC school, and how each of the schools uses those extra couple of scholarships is going to be fascinating to see. How is NIL impacted by this? How is also just total scholarships across the board for all sports? Because even one like baseball is going to get an increase as well. But there is at least early speculation that not everyone will be able to take advantage of that. You do have some Title IX and compliance issues that have to come into play as well here. All of this really dictated by by football, which had its number increased from, I believe it was 85 to 105, which obviously does also can then change how different teams are going to really allocate those extra roster spots, those extra scholarships to players, and maybe what the depth at the mid-major level or the lower levels might be if the high majors are then able to stockpile a few more scholarship players on their teams. But a long road to get to there. It's not official yet. This is something that the NCAA is expected to put into place. So we'll see what the timeline is on that front and moving forward. The other note I wanted to talk about was something that I could have talked about in the last episode, and I just missed talking about this one. So St. Mary's did have an open assistant coach spot after Justin Joyner left for Michigan, but they did recently replace that roster spot, and they replaced it with a very familiar face for St. Mary's alums and someone from the very first NCAA tournament run. E.J. Rowland, who graduated in 2005, it was part of that first Randy Bennett NCAA tournament team at St. Mary's, will be returning as an assistant coach on that squad. And it's a fascinating move because E.J. Rowland has been playing professionally overseas for essentially the last 20 years. And this is someone who has continued to be part of the St. Mary's culture. He does regularly come back for the alumni games. He makes appearances in his off seasons. This is someone who is still connected to the St. Mary's program, and another point guard who is being added to this roster. And you now look at the coaching staff, at least of former players that Randy Bennett has kind of grouped up. You have E.J. Rowland, who was obviously a point guard for that first tournament team. You have Mickey McConnell, who is one of the associate head coaches, and he was on that Sweet 16 team. And then you have Joe Rayhan, who is also he was a point guard for that 2017 team that went to the NCAA tournament. And then even you have Dan Sheets, who was on that coaching staff, who was obviously like one of those guys who was deeper on the bench. But you look at the squad. This is a team with a bunch of St. Mary's guys as their assistant coaches, and that says a lot about the culture of St. Mary's. That it not only brings people back, but you have guys who want to be involved in coaching, involved at St. Mary's, and so it is. I looked at that, I saw that, and that was great news. I thought it was a great fit for EJ Rowland to be that next guy to step into that. And now you have, again, 4 former St. Mary's players as assistants on that staff on Randy Bennett's staff, which says a lot about Randy. It says a lot about the program and just the sorts of minds that he's bringing in, because as we've seen, like Randy Bennett's guys have gone on to be good coaches in other spots. So we'll obviously start talking a little bit more, get in depth in the weeks to come about what each of these teams are doing and everything else. But let's get to Andy. Let's talk some Zags basketball, and let's see what his thoughts are as we start moving closer and closer to the season. It's always great to be able to talk with Andy Patton from the Locked On Zags and Locked On College Basketball podcast. You can find them on YouTube and your favorite streaming services. Andy, how's your summer been, and how excited are you to finally be able to talk some real basketball in just a short now period of time?
Summer's been great. Yeah, we're definitely in the doldrums of the offseason from a college basketball perspective. We're a long ways away from last season, and we're still a fairly long ways away from this upcoming season as well. And there's only so many different conversations you can have about a 1, 12, 13-man roster for Gonzaga. But thankfully, we got some Olympic coverage on the show to keep us going with a handful of Zags participating, some Gales participating as well. So that's been kind of helping keep some of the excitement and some game watches and stuff going on here as we're in that middle of the summer. But yeah, it's been a little nice to have a bit of a break too from the chaos that is the actual college basketball season.
Absolutely, yeah. It's nice to have that little bit of a break, but now it's kind of like getting a little bit of the basketball withdrawal right now. Mm-hmm. The Olympics just ain't cutting it. They need a little bit more than just that. But one of the things we got to see, so this was a really good offseason for Gonzaga, and we could point to any number of the things, how they hit the portal, the guys who came back. We can talk about what the schedule is starting to look like and some of the big games there. Mark View participating. He's one of the assistant coaches with Team USA. It's like this has been a big offseason. How would you rate the offseason that the Zags have had, and maybe how that might compare with some of the others in maybe like the last decade or so?
Yeah, it's been an insanely great offseason for Gonzaga. I mean, their wish list, their checklist of things that they wanted to get done, if it's not complete, I can't imagine what else would have been on there that they didn't get done. I mean, they got full 13 scholarships, all filled on the roster. They filled some spots for the present with Michael Ajayi and Caleb Fattle coming in, who are going to immediately step into roles. They filled some future spots with, of course, Braden Smith, who's going to redshirt this year and be likely the immediate starting point guard for this team after that when Ryan Nembhard graduates. They fill a spot with Ismaila Diane, who could be a potentially very high upside big for this team in the future. Some other kind of role player types like Emmanuel Inocente. They checked every box that you wanted to. They've recruited well. They're still in the mix for some very high-end talent like Isaiah Harwell, Kingston Fleming. That are 2 top 15 prospects in the 2025 class that they're in the mix for. Nick Kaminia as well. They already landed Davis Fogel, who's a high riser in that class. So you managed to do pretty much exactly what you need. And I think the biggest thing in this offseason is not newcomers and it's not recruits. It's that they didn't lose anybody of serious consequence either. Like the only players that left who were on scholarship were Anton Watson, who was of course out of eligibility, and then the 2 international freshmen from last year, Luka Krajinovic and Pavle Stosic, who frankly were probably kind of pushed a little bit out of the lineup for Gonzaga, or out of the scholarship picture for the team. And I think that's kind of been more or less confirmed that Gonzaga kind of wanted those scholarships for other players. So you can't really do any better than that. And going into an offseason where there was concern about, hey, Mark Few's going to be gone like he was a lot of last offseason with the FIBA stuff. And, Gonzaga lost a lot of key players last year. Hunter Salas transfers, Efton Reed, Dominic Harris. And so for this offseason to have basically wrapped up early. They got all the guys they wanted early in the season. They got some future additions early. They kind of just checked everything off. Mark Few gets to go hang out in Paris and have a blast and not really have to worry about his roster because it's fully set. There's a lot of continuity on the roster. The new guys I think are going to fit really well into the system and into the roles that they want. Steel Venters is going to be healthy. Like there's really not a lot of things that I mean, there's really nothing that went wrong this offseason and no real kind of hanging thread still. This team feels complete and ready to roll. And it's hard to not be any happier as a Gonzaga fan right now.
Right. I was going to ask him just like how much relief there must be just kind of knowing is like that now it's kind of set at this point of like, and pretty confidently set in a lot of these different roles and a lot of the new guys. Again, mentioned Khalif Battle, you mentioned Braden Smith, like the pieces are set up for a while. And the continuity part, we talked about it with St. Mary's a year ago, like just the continuity that they had coming back was like about almost the entire starting five return, or the anticipated starting five all came back. And that's more or less what Gonzaga has coming back. Obviously, like four of the five starters return, sans Anton Watson, and you have a lot of guys, Michael Ajayi, thinking about guys who are going to start to fill into those roles. So that kind of leads me into like, which of these Zag newcomers do you think are going to have maybe like the biggest impact, maybe early on and then maybe long term into the season? I want to even include like Steel Venters into that mix because we didn't get to see him at all a year ago.
Yeah, I think like first of all, the continuity is such a huge factor for Gonzaga this season because we saw what it meant to not have it last year. The first half of the season for Gonzaga, they really didn't find their identity. And in Mark Few's system, the center is such a critical position, and the point guard, you know, in any offense is a critical position. And to have two guys who were extremely talented but hadn't played together with each other and hadn't played in the system, you saw that really play out in some, a loss to Washington, a loss to San Diego State, and obviously tougher losses to teams like Purdue and UConn that they might not have won anyway. But still, like you saw how much having that continuity matters. And now to have a situation where whoever is the fifth starter, we'll see what that lineup looks like. Almost certainly Gonzaga is going to have four returning starters. And in terms of who's going to be the most impactful player, it's really a close toss up between Michael Ajayi and Khalif Battle for next season. Obviously, both those guys are one and done. This is their final year of eligibility, so they are only going to be in the program for 1 year. I think Ajayi is probably the lean because I think he's going to start. I think he's going to start at the 3 with Ben Gregg and Graham Ike starting at the 4 and the 5. I also think Ajayi is going to play a lot of minutes at the 4. I think we're going to see a lot of lineups where he's at the 4 and Ike's at the 5, or Braden Huff's at the 5, or even some small ball lineups where Ben Gregg is playing the 5. And we've seen Gonzaga use these kind of 3-4 hybrid forwards. Corey Kispert played some 3 and 4. Julian Strother didn't play a ton of 4, but he did a little bit. So we've seen Gonzaga utilize that. And Ajayi, he led the WCC in scoring last year. He averaged about 10 rebounds a game. Like he's an incredible scorer. He's a dynamic player. And I think he's coming into a system where, sure, he's not going to get as many touches. His usage rate is going to go down, but I wouldn't be surprised if the efficiency ticks up because he's not going to be the opposing team's kind of focal point defensively. So I would lean him, but I also wouldn't be shocked if Khalif Battle is an all WCC player, if he's like a shoe-in 6th Man of the Year award winner coming off the bench. I think Gonzaga is going to play a lot of 3-guard lineups with Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard and Khalif Battle. And again, Ajayi potentially playing the 4 in those lineups. They're just going to be, they're going to be an absolute menace out in transition with that lineup. It's going to be insane. And we know Mark Few loves to do that. So that team's going to run and run and run. And I think you'll see a lot of those lineups. So I wouldn't be surprised if Battle and Ajayi are 2 of Gonzaga's top 5 for sure scorers on this roster. Ajayi's probably going to have a slightly bigger role, so I lean him, but I think both those guys are going to be great. I think Steel Venters is going to have a role, although I'm not sure how early into the season we'll see him, just with recovering from that injury. The other guys I don't think will have a big impact right away necessarily, but I'm excited about the future for guys like Braden Smith and Emmanuel Nicente and Ismaila Diane. I think all those guys are contributors down the line for Gonzaga, but I would be surprised. We won't see Smith at all. I'd be pretty surprised if we saw, I think Innocente is maybe 10th in the rotation right now. Diani is 11th probably. So I don't think we're going to see either of those guys very much, but excited about the future for what they bring.
One name you didn't I don't think I heard you bring up was Dusty Stromer. I mean, how he maybe fits into all this. Obviously, like a ton of talent and very similar positions at what
Mm-hmm.
he would probably be stepping into. We
Mm-hmm.
know that he was given too much early
Mm-hmm.
on a year ago, and it wasn't supposed to be his role.
Right.
The that wasn't what the expectation for him was going to be. So he did struggle as the season went on. But
Mm-hmm.
going into year two, like how does maybe like what do you see his role and how his fit is going to be with this squad?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by how it's going to play out because you have your four returning starters, Nemhard, Hickman, Greg, and Ike. You have Ajayi probably taking that fifth spot. You have Caliph Battle filling a role. That's six right there. And Mark Few doesn't play more than eight pretty much ever. Sometimes he only plays seven. So you have those six. You have Braden Huff, who's guaranteed to be in the rotation after what he did last year. So that's seven. And then you have 8-9. And 8-9 is Stromer and Venters, or it's Venters and Stromer. Like that, it's kind of depends. Again, how healthy Steele is coming into the season is a huge factor. But the best case scenario for Dusty right now is still probably the eighth man in the rotation. And that doesn't typically generate a ton of playing time in Mark Few's system. And being the ninth man sometimes doesn't get you off the bench except in garbage time, like realistically. But I'm having a really hard time seeing a fully healthy Gonzaga team not playing nine. However, if you were to go back and find audio clips of me in August of 2023 and 2022, and every year going forward, we have this conversation where we're like, how the heck is Mark Few going to play less than nine guys? And he pretty much always does. So that's what it's hard for me to imagine Stromer significantly declining in terms of minutes per game just because he's a rising sophomore. We saw glimpses of him look a lot better in the second half last year once he kind of had a more defined role, once he switched out of the starting lineup with Ben Gregg, was coming off the bench. He was more consistent hitting his corner 3-point shots. He's a very good defensive player, even as a freshman. He's bulked up. He's about 8 to 10 pounds heavier. Like I see a potential for him to have a really big sophomore year, but the playing time is just kind of a big mystery right now. So if it's not him, or if it is him, then that means Steele Venters maybe isn't playing the minutes that a lot of people expect him to play. If Venters is healthy and contributing in a way that Gonzaga desperately needs some outside shooting on this roster, like Battle's not a great 3-point shooter. Ajayi was a low volume guy. So they still need 3-point shooting. Venters brings that. If he plays that role, what happens to Dusty? I'm really interested because it feels like one of those two guys is going to be borderline out of the rotation. And I can't figure out who it's going to be unless Venters is still recovering. That's kind of the big hinge. If he's still hurting and he's not at 100%, then Dusty definitely claims that spot and holds on to it as long as he's continuing to play well. But and then you have a guy like Emmanuel Innocente, who was very good in the WAC last year, was a highly productive player, and he's not even sniffing the rotation, quite honestly. It's an embarrassment of riches for Mark Few this year.
And because it's an embarrassment of riches, because you look at that continuity with all the expectations, obviously, like almost every way too early poll has the Zags at the very least in the top 10, if not the top 5, going into next year. Now it's starting to think about what should the expectation of this team should be, and I'm trying to like lean on the don't is now championship now the expectation, and is anything short of that a disappointment? Because a championship is just so difficult, as everyone in college basketball knows. So many different things can happen in the tournament. Injuries happen, just teams go on runs. You just never know. So what maybe is your realistic expectation of what this team could be? Because I think we know what the ceiling obviously is for what they can do.
Yeah, I think I don't think this is a fair ceiling or a fair expectation to have necessarily, but fans will be disappointed if this team doesn't make the Elite Eight. I think that's an entirely reasonable way to look at this season, as reasonable as that kind of expectation can be for a college basketball program, I should say. They've made the Sweet 16 9 years in a row. Like if they do that again, that's incredible. 10-year streak is I mean, what an accomplishment that would be. But if that's as far as they go with this group, I think people are going to be a little disappointed. And part of it is that this is kind of the end of this era. It's a short era because, Graham Ike and Ryan Nembhard weren't here for very long, but like Ryan Nembhard's out of eligibility after this. Nolan Hickman's done. Michael Ajayi's done. Caliph Battle's done. Ben Gregg is done. Graham Ike and Steele Venters are both technically have additional eligibility. the kind of prevailing consensus right now is that we wouldn't expect to see both of them back. If Graham Ike has another all WCC caliber campaign, I don't think he comes back for another year. He does have that eligibility, but it would be his 7th year of college basketball, same with Steele Venters. So if those two guys are gone too, next year's roster after this is going to look a lot different. That's why Braden Smith's such a critical addition. You still have Braden Huff. You still have Dusty Stromer. You still have, Emmanuel Innocente, Smiley Diane. Davis Fogel comes into the mix. They got some other, they're going to be fine. It's not like it's going to fall off a cliff. It never does for Gonzaga. But this is kind of the end of like, hey, this is an old, deep, experienced, talented championship caliber roster. Next year's team, we can't necessarily say that for. So I think for this year, you got to get to the Elite Eight. This team should be in the Final Four. They're good enough to be in the Final Four with the continuity that they have, with the way they played in the second half of last year, the depth, shoring up the areas that were concerns last year. It's hard to not see an expectation of this team needs to advance farther than they did last year. They need to be in the Elite Eight. They need to be in the Final Four. And this feels like one of Gonzaga's best chances to win a national championship, since they went there in 2021 and 2017. I think the 2019 team with Brandon Clark and Rui Hachimura was one of the best teams that they've had, and they got upset. I mean, they lost the Elite Eight, so upset. But outside of that, this team is probably as deep and prepared to be in that conversation as any team they've had in a while. And I think that the expectations are going to reflect that.
Yeah, and especially when you think about last year being the quote down year, and they still got to the Sweet 16. Yep. That getting back to the Sweet 16 doesn't seem that's not enough, right, with a team that has the continuity, with the guys that they brought in, with the guys that return. But now thinking about those teams that did get to the championship game, the 21 team, the 17 team, how would, at least on paper, looking at this roster compared to those rosters, because I know there was a lot of more NBA star power on those teams, and maybe you on paper look at this team, because I think maybe Michael Ajayi is your best NBA prospect. Ryan Nembhard, I think you can throw in there as well. But on paper, how would you kind of line this one up against maybe some of the other teams? But then maybe the landscape of college basketball obviously is different from just those 2 years as well.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it too, is that this Gonzaga team is not as NBA star power driven. That 17 team had Zach Collins was the NBA lottery pick, but he was coming off the bench. I think it's possible that Braden Huff becomes an NBA player with his kind of combination of skill set. I don't think he's going to be the 10th player picked in the 2025 NBA draft the way Zach Collins was. And certainly, even if he was, he's not a true freshman the way Collins was. But Ryan Nembhard is a very good college player. He's an All-American caliber player. Graham Ike is an All-American caliber player. Neither of them strike me as promising NBA talent, in part because Nembhard is about 5 inches shorter than his brother. And Graham Ike, similar situation to Drew Timme, is just doesn't have the game that reflects the modern NBA, even though he's a very good college player. So I do think that Gonzaga's NBA talent is not as significant. I think Ajayi is their best bet. Maybe Ben Gregg gets I could see him being a late second round guy if he shoots 40+% from three this year. But yeah, they don't have the Jalen Suggs. They don't even have a Nigel Williams-Goss necessarily, although Ryan Nembhard is close to that. But this team has a ton of depth, and I think that's a huge part of it. If Venters is healthy, they have more outside shooting. They're also very experienced. You have so many 4-year guys, 5-year guys, and I think that really helps. But I think that goes to the other point that you made of a lot of teams in college basketball are old, and a lot of teams in college basketball are experienced. The amount of depth on rosters at Alabama and Kansas and North Carolina and Duke and many of these other teams is tremendous. I mean, I feel like the top 10 or top 15 rosters in college basketball heading into the season are unbelievably stacked. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, NIL plays a huge role. Transfer portal plays an arguably bigger role. It has allowed these teams to stock up in ways that they haven't been able to before. And Gonzaga took advantage of it, as they totally should have, and made a great move with Braden Smith to be able to kind of use that ability to stockpile talent to address future rosters. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of really good teams in college basketball this year. I think Gonzaga is well equipped to be a national championship contender. But yeah, when you don't have a Jalen Suggs, when you don't have that kind of, four elite post players, the way that 2017 team did with Karnowski and Williams and Collins and Killian Tilly. I mean, Killian Tilly was your fourth big. Like, that's an insane amount of depth for that team to have had on that roster. But I think you're looking at a team here that is absolutely capable of competing in the modern college basketball, even without the same amount of NBA talent that maybe some of those other rosters have had.
Yeah, this Gonzaga team is going to be just incredible to watch early on. A lot of great early tests in that non-conference. Obviously, UConn again, UCLA at the new Intuit Dome down in LA, which is going to be exciting. I mean, just like looking up and down, like the destination list. I was talking with Theo Lawson from Spokesman Review a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about like what his travel schedule is going to be like and what his favorite on that list. And obviously, like it was like the Bahamas obviously is the first off that list for the battle for Atlanta. So obviously, like that's the destination top top on the list. But now, like taking a step back and looking at the WCC as a whole, a lot of teams I felt like had good off seasons, and like to varying degrees or whatnot, and what they added, what was subtracted. Who do you think, just taking a quick look at this, of like who had outside of Gonzaga, who had the best off season of the WCC teams?
Yeah, I think it's always kind of hard to evaluate that in terms of, are you just looking at talent in versus talent in and talent out? Because I think that plays a big factor in how you have these conversations. Like, Washington State brought in a ton of great transfers, but they also lost their entire roster. Literally everybody's gone. And so when you lose an entire roster from a team that was a 7 seed, it's very hard to then say, okay, yeah, sure, they brought in a couple of guys from Eastern who I think are going to be very good and are going to be good WCC players. But how do you reckon with, okay, sure, they brought in more transfer portal talent than even, a team like even Gonzaga in terms of, the quantity of players, but that's because they had more spots to fill. So I think that makes these conversations trickier. And St. Mary's kind of falls in an interesting spot where I like a lot of the additions they made. I like some of the freshmen they got coming in. I really like the Arizona transfer coming over. Like, he's going to be really good. I think he's going to be a potential all WCC caliber player. But how do you rank St. Mary's offseason when they also lost arguably their best player in Aiden Mahaney, or arguably their second or third best player in Joshua Jefferson? Like, it's great that they kept Marcelonis. It's great that they kept Saxon, but those are two huge, monumental losses for that program. So, I think that makes it a little trickier. So I'd probably have St. Mary's a little bit lower because of that. Whereas a team like LMU is a bit more interesting to me. I really like what Stan Johnson and the Lions were able to accomplish this offseason. They hire Lorenzo Romar. It helps them land Javon Porter, who could be really, really talented. He's got to get his head on straight. That's an issue for him, but he's an all WCC caliber player. They lose Dominic Harris, who was one of their best players last year, but they get Jan Vide coming from UCLA. It was a little trade there between those two LA area schools. I think Vide is a breakout candidate in a significant way. I also think he could be an all WCC player. So I like a lot of what LMU did, even though they also lost, Michael Graham hit the transfer portal. They lost a couple other pieces, but LMU's offseason is pretty high on my list, just in terms of kind of what I would have liked to see a program like that do. On a lot of the other teams, I just wasn't super thrilled about a lot of the off seasons in the WCC. Portland lost a ton of talent. They got some okay pieces back. San Diego lost a huge chunk of their talent this offseason in the transfer portal. Like, Pacific, I think, is going in the right direction, but it was still a rough offseason for them. So I wasn't thrilled about a ton of the off seasons in the WCC, but, we weren't talking, there wasn't a lot of conversation about, like, let's say Jonathan Mobo at this time last year. We're kind of like, oh, maybe that'll be a good addition for San Francisco. He ended up being great. So, I think there's some pieces that we're not thinking about, that we're not talking about, that will end up being in this conversation, 6, 7, 8 months from now.
At least one, I think, like that, because I think the way just we are with the transfer portal and everything else, that almost one of the big, did you win the offseason, was how much of your roster did you keep?
Yeah.
How many guys didn't go anywhere else and you were able to hold on to them? And almost that's why I kind of look at Santa Clara in a lot of ways because of that. They were able to keep Adama Ball. They were able to keep Christoph Tilley. Johnny O'Neal is sticking around. You have a lot of guys on that. I think they lost one player to the transfer portal. And then they were able to bring in a familiar face in Carlos Stewart, which was obviously like you and I had talked about, like just the shocker that was. We even kind of have had the double take because we thought it was Carlos Marshall, not
Yeah.
Carlos Stewart. It's like, I thought he was out of eligibility.
Yeah.
And yeah, bringing Carlos Stewart back, a guy that we know has performed at a high level in the WCC and has caused headaches for everybody in the league. So I at least like I think you have to almost I start to look at it in a different way now versus maybe like a few years ago where holding on to your guys wasn't a big deal a few years ago. Now it's like it's a huge deal. Actually, all right, we held on to all of our good players. Everyone of significance did not leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you think about Santa Clara, like Adama Ball, not only could he have gone to the NBA where a lot of people projected he'd be a second round pick, he also could have transferred again. Like we know that the transfer rules don't really, two-time transfers are not being penalized. So he could have hit the portal and gone back to the Power 5 level pretty easily if he'd wanted to. And he chose not to do that. And I think you look at a top four for Santa Clara of Tilly, O'Neal, Ball, and Stewart. I mean, that's great. That's a really, really good group right there. So I think you're absolutely right. They don't stand out if you're looking at like a list of transfer portal additions or even subtractions. Santa Clara doesn't stand out because there wasn't a lot of movement in that regard. But that by itself is a good thing for them because they didn't lose any of those key pieces. I think Santa Clara is absolutely going to contend for a 3 through 5 spot in this conference. I think Gonzaga is still at the top. I think St. Mary's is still going to be in that conversation. I think Washington State, we'll see how Riley puts all the pieces together, but them and Santa Clara, and we'll see about San Francisco. I kind of wasn't sure. I'm still not really sure how I feel about their offseason yet. I mean, they lose Mobo, which is huge. They lose Sheriff Joms transfers, and that's a tough loss, although I'm not sure he was a great fit in that system. But they keep somebody like Ryan Beasley, who I think is going to step into a big role and be a nice piece for them. They keep a lot of other key pieces as well. So I think Gerlofson's team in San Francisco could be pretty solid next year, but their offseason didn't wow me necessarily. But again, they were the team that had some under-the-radar additions last year, so maybe he did it again.
Yeah, USF at the very least, I think I'm looking at them as like they are going to have the most guard depth of anyone in the league, especially like we of known guys like Marcus Williams. You look at we mentioned Ryan Beasley. You think about even Torres, who they were able to bring in through the transfer portal. And I keep blanking on one of the other names. I'm like,
Wong. Was it Wong?
No, not Wong. I was thinking USC transfer name.
Malik Thomas.
Malik Thomas.
Yeah, there you go.
Obviously, like being one of the breakout guys last year,
he was really good.
Really played again. Like this is a deep at the guard spot. Like I'm concerned about their front court a bit more and whether or not they can actually be bang with again a lot. Especially you look at Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and Santa Clara. These are just big teams, and that is a big challenge as you're starting to work through the WCC. All right, one of the other things, and you started to kind of hint at one of the guys that might be on this list for you is like a breakout star for next year, because obviously, like I feel like there's a good solid number of transfers who've come in who are going to get a great opportunity to really break out this year, but then there's some guys who are returning who are going to have more opportunity. And as you're starting to look around the league, as you're starting to like scout for Gonzaga or think about that, like who are some guys in this league that are, it's like, okay, I now have to start paying attention to this guy. Looks like there's a lot of potential here.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and I'll mention three actually that I already mentioned at some point in the show. One of them is Morauskas heading over to St. Mary's from Arizona. We have seen Arizona transfers go to the WCC and succeed. We saw it with the Adama Ball. We've seen it a handful of times in this conference of being able to land high major players who didn't get the playing time that they thought they were going to get or that they wanted to get at their high major school, and they come to the WCC and they thrive. And I think Morauskas, this guy averaged only about 2.5, 3 points a game at Arizona last year, but he was killing it this summer. He's a 6'8" Lithuanian forward. He can do a little bit of everything. I like the fit in Randy Bennett's offense. I think you kind of talk about breaking out in terms of statistical breakout. It's always a little bit harder to do at St. Mary's just because of the possessions. Like he's not going to go out and average 17 points a game, whereas like that is something he might be capable of doing in a different system, but he's going to be incredibly impactful. I think nobody's going to want to deal with him if he kind of adjusts to this system the way that I think he's capable of doing. I wouldn't be surprised if he's an all WCC caliber contributor for this team. And then it's Jan Vide is the other one. I already mentioned him as well, transferring from UCLA to LMU. Vide was a guy who Gonzaga was interested in landing as a recruit internationally. He's from Slovenia, and he ended up going to UCLA. And averaged less than 2 points a game for Mick Cronin's team, but that team was just a mess last year. There was a lot of playing time situations that felt odd, and offense was just incredibly stagnant at times. Mick Cronin was unhappy about how things went last year and let everybody in the entire world know about it. And I think that Vide's, I mean, he only played 24 games, only played about 7 minutes a game, so we just never really got to see him, but he was really good in high school. He was really good internationally. Again, Gonzaga was in on him for a reason. I think that getting unlocked at LMU is something that could very reasonably happen for him and lead to him being, I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the 10 leading scorers in the conference. And I honestly wouldn't be shocked if he's one of the top 5 leading scorers in the conference either. Like, that really wouldn't surprise me. And then I'll mention Ryan Beasley as well, just somewhat quickly. Because he's not as much of a breakout in the sense that, he averaged 8 points a game on 22 minutes a game last year. So he was already really good as a freshman. And for USF, they already have a lot of guard talent still on the roster, but there is an opening for a bigger role with Sheriff Jomscon, and I think Beasley is going to step into that role. He was the WCC Rookie of the Year last year. I wouldn't be surprised if he's all WCC as a sophomore either.
Yeah, I really do like the idea of Ryan Beasley. I think during the St. Mary's USF game last year where he and Mahaney were going back and forth at one point. Mm-hmm. It was trading bucket for bucket, and I was at that moment excited to actually see those two go back and forth for mm-hmm. the next couple of years. Obviously, that's not going to happen anymore, but mm-hmm. that was a whole high school rivalry as well. Yeah. Like Doherty Valley and Camp Alindo, those two were going at it even in high school. So that, again, seeing that carry over to college was fun, at least for the one night, mm-hmm. Even though we're not going to get to see that long term. Now starting to look at this WCC, obviously, like we know, like Gonzaga is, even in my mind, is just the clear favorite. I know St. Mary's is coming off back-to-back WCC championships. Mm-hmm. Gonzaga, again, I can't not think about. I made the argument last year that St. Mary's, because of the continuity, Gonzaga has the greater continuity this year. So mm-hmm. I have to stay consistent on that front and actually mm-hmm. pick them. But like looking around, and you mentioned a little bit of just like how you kind of like see all these kind of like starting to work themselves out. Do you still see St. Mary's as the kind of like the clear 2, and then there's still the kind of like the grouping of everybody else 3 through 6 or whatever it is?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's going to be some people who probably are more likely to push St. Mary's down. People really like the idea of somebody else competing for second in the WCC. Even when St. Mary's has been the favorite, sometimes people are like, well, what if, in the past, what if BYU, clips Gonzaga, or what if San Francisco or Santa Clara can do it? And like, people always try to do that to St. Mary's too, and say like, oh, like they're going to be third, they're going to be fourth. I think there was a few years ago where people thought they were going to be fifth. They almost never are. It almost never happens that way. And I think St. Mary's did a good enough job bringing in players to help replace the talent that they're losing. Obviously, it's hard to replace Naden Mahaney. It's hard to replace Joshua Jefferson, but I think Morauskas is a guy who's can potentially kind of alleviate some of that loss with Joshua Jefferson. And so I think you and then you get Penny Hardaway's kid coming in as well too, Ashton Hardaway. So I think that the system that St. Mary's and Randy Bennett runs is good enough to continue to pick off the Santa Claras and the San Franciscos and the Washington States to kind of stay in second place. I think they're more vulnerable than they've been in the past, but you still have Mitchell Saxon. He's going to be one of the best big men in the entire conference, if not the best. Him and Graham Ike are going to compete there in the front court. Saxon's a great defender. He's kind of continued to grow as a rebounder and low post scorer. You still have the reigning WCC Player of the Year in Marcelonis coming back. And so I think with those two guys, with some of the new pieces coming in, I still think St. Mary's is number 2. And then after that, I think Santa Clara is probably third, and I think they're the biggest challenge for St. Mary's. Like, I think if anybody is second that's not St. Mary's, I would probably guess it's Santa Clara, just because, as we talked about, with Adama Ball coming back, with Carlos Stewart transferring back, with not losing a ton of other pieces, O'Neal and Tilly in that front court is going to be great. And then I think after that, Washington State 4, San Francisco 5, that's kind of LMU 6, and then after that, it's just kind of the rest of the group there. Oregon State, San Diego, Pacific, Pepperdine, whatever order you want to do there, Portland. I think they can kind of all mix around interchangeably, but I think that Santa Clara and St. Mary's are going to compete for second, but it's the Gales to lose.
All right. Thanks a lot, Andy, for hopping on. It's always great to chat with you and talk WCC basketball. Obviously, we're still quite a few months away, but starting to at least rev it up a little bit more as we get closer and closer to the start of the academic years, and then, of course, getting into the season. So thanks a lot, Andy, for hopping on, and we'll definitely catch up down the road.
Sounds good, Zach. Always happy to do it. Thanks again.
All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Thanks a lot for listening. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite streaming services. Follow along on social media at Post by Zach, and then also at Unofficial WCC Pod. That'll do it. Thanks a lot for watching, listening, wherever you are, and I will catch you later.